Hey everyone, you're listening to God's Whole Story. This year we're taking a book-by-book journey throughout Scripture to see how God uses the story of Scripture to accomplish His purposes. If you enjoy the content, we would love to partner with you. Look at the show notes to see how you can do that, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Today we are looking at the book of Judges, which I will tell you is probably the worst book in the Bible. Honestly.
So keep listening.
Actually,
if you were having a bad morning...
Okay.
No.
This is true story. My wife and I read through the Bible from beginning to end for the first time in our lives, like last year. And when we finished the book of Judges, my wife was like, I don't know about this. Because honestly, like what's the last chapter? Is it 19 or 20? How many chapters are in Judges?
22, 24.
You guys are like, we're listening to you, and you don't know that?
Yeah. Tell us, Ryan. Is that when they lie in wait for women or something?
There's 21 chapters. I would say that probably Judges 19 to 21, if you want to read the worst story in the Bible, that's probably the one. And probably the second worst, I would say, there's some close seconds, but there are several very concerning stories in Judges. But I think you should read them, and I think you should be aware of them, because I think on this podcast, we're all about like, hey, read the Bible. When you're not aware of these stories and people confront you with them, you will have a faith crisis of sorts, because you'll feel like that's not in the Bible, and then you'll read it and you'll be like, oh my goodness, this is in the Bible.
There's a lot of stuff in the Bible that is shocking. And
you should read it, and you should strive to understand it, and feel free to be frustrated by it. Feel free to be upset by it. We do need to read the whole thing, and we do need to strive to understand the whole thing. And Judges, I would say, is one of those books. Somehow we've lifted out, Judges being the dark book that it is, somehow we've lifted out stories that we think are like cute and pithy. But even the way we present those is sort of a polished version.
What would be some of the ones you're referring to?
So this was a long intro. Now we're going to start hitting the ground here. Samson, super polished. My guess would be, if you've never read the book of Judges, your understanding of Samson is way more positive than the real story.
Yeah.
Gideon, I would guess that if you think Gideon is a fantastic person, read his story in the Bible. You will think he is less fantastic of a person. Those are the two that pop out to me. Would you add to that list at all?
I think those are my top two.
Yeah, I think that would be.
And then you just have ones that we don't really talk about because they are so distressing that we really can't find a whole lot redemptive in it to present in a Sunday school class or a flannel graph design from ancient decades.
Every time I talk about flannel graph, I was like, people don't even know what that is anymore. True. Ryan, stop talking about that. But I love it. I love it.
Go ahead and Google flannel graph.
Oh gosh.
I think that's a safe search.
I think when the Mennonites were teaching me with the flannel graph in the 90s, they were already too old. So, okay, so here's the pattern of Judges, y'all. All the distractions aside. The pattern of Judges is that, one, we ended last week with the book of Joshua. Joshua makes this compelling statement: as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. What's interesting is, why did he need to make that statement? Well, because some of his people were not serving the Lord. That's actually called out in that statement. When we get to the book of Judges, the people are coming into the land. They did not complete the task that was given to them, whether they misinterpreted some pieces or just rebelled against other pieces. And what happens in the book of Judges is we start to, one, there's a cycle. There's always a cycle to the stories. So the people start out serving God well. Then they get kind of lazy. They start to reject God or not do everything that he's commanded. God puts them under judgment. As they suffer under judgment, God raises up a judge because the people call for help. The judge delivers them. Then they are faithful for a bit, and then they just feel like being faithful gets old for a bit, and the cycle spins. So the cycle spins in a circle, in that is what they're constantly doing, but it's a downward circle in that it gets worse and worse and worse.
To get to chapter 19.
19 through 21. Worst story in the whole book, honestly.
It might also be helpful, too, to just point out that when we're talking about judges here, we're not talking about like the judges that we would think today of legal systems or judicial judges. These are essentially like regional rulers of different areas. So they're not kings. They're not, like in the position that Joshua was, but God would raise up, often the book would say the people will cry out for a deliverer, and God raises up a judge who delivers them from the enemy that is oppressing them, and then usually there is a season of rest or peace for a number of years. And so the book of Judges gets its name because these people were called judges. They were judges over different areas. It actually says there was no king in the land at this time. And one of the phrases that we see that I think sums up the book the most is that in almost every one of these cycles, or at least many of them, it has this repeated phrase that the people do what is right in their own eyes.
Oh, man.
And they don't do what is right in God's eyes. They don't do what they committed to do, or their forefathers committed to do with the covenant. They do what is right in their own eyes. And that's where we see that downward spiral into deeper and deeper and darker things.
Oh, judges.
Yeah.
Aren't you encouraged?
In my commentary, it says that by the end of the book, Israel has violated God's commandments in almost every single way.
Also, what's really interesting, by the end of the book, we start out with the people of Israel relatively united coming into the promised land. The book actually ends with the people of Israel almost completely wiping out an entire tribe of people, their own people. So the original audience would have heard these stories being like, oh, they're coming into the promised land. How exciting. And by the end, it's like, oh my goodness, they almost killed off themselves completely. And then they need to, like, I guess, make up a solution where they, like, try to keep that tribe going. And even that is like, oh, what's going on here?
You know, it's kind of like this book actually does give us a little bit of a realistic perspective on human nature. You know, I remember so many times in various forms of ministry that, you know, people where I was leading, like, they would sin and we would be so, like, surprised. Like, how could they do that? Judges is actually showing us this, like, this is what people do. Like, they mess up, they're broken, that apart from God actively working in their lives and apart from, like, them making a serious commitment to follow him, this is the natural default course, that if you're not actively pursuing God, like, you're going to kind of drift into this place where you find yourself doing horrible things and things maybe that you didn't even intend on. That it's really a study in broken humanity. And through it, though, we see God's mercy.
Well, it's amazing that God chooses to use these humans. Like, I mean, you don't have a single character in Judges that I can think of off the top of my head that is like a Moses or a Joshua. They're all like, they might do one great thing. They might be heroic, but then they are like leading the people to worship other gods. They're very flawed. And so, but what's amazing about Judges to me is that God keeps using them anyway. So God's sovereignty and his willingness to use broken humanity to carry out his plans is pretty incredible. Yeah.
If you haven't thought this on our journey so far, this may be the first time you think, God, why don't you just wipe these people out? Like, why don't you
the first of many times
choose another group of people? Why do you continue to be faithful to this group of people? And if maybe that happened when they grumbled and complained in Numbers, maybe it's happening in Judges, but you're going to see this again and again, that as you follow the journey of the people that God chooses, you're going to find I find myself doing this, like, we would judge them and punish them far faster than God does. And we're just like, come on already, God. They're so unfaithful, but God is patient.
And he's faithful to his covenant that he made with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Like, he's not going to forget that covenant, which is amazing.
So in the midst of the darkness, the hero of this story is not any of the judges. The hero of Judges is God. That his plan is continuing to move forward in spite of so much wickedness, so much sin, so many horrible examples of people. His plan is moving forward.
Incredible.
So, let's look at some of these stories.
Let's do it.
Are you going to talk about Deborah?
She might be one of the best characters in the book.
Like I said, you know, like, the book just gets worse as it goes. And Deborah I think we're introduced to Deborah in chapter 4.
Yeah, pretty early.
So tell us about Deborah, Chelsea.
Oh, no, I want to hear what you have
You want
to
to
say
hear what
about
I have
Deborah.
to? What do you want to hear? What I have to say about Deborah?
Whatever you have to give, I'll take it.
Okay, so I don't love just jumping right into these topics. Actually, sometimes I do. Okay, so Deborah is she's a judge and she's a priestess. Is that right? Like she's known to
She's a prophetess.
Not priestess, prophetess. She sits under a specific tree, actually, to give her prophecies. And what I like to point out about Deborah, one, is that this is one of the shinier spots in the book because, again, it's just going to spin downwards. If you are someone who believes that God does not want women in leadership, you do have to make sense of why he chose Deborah to lead the people. And I think there are compelling cases on either side, but sometimes I just like, when it comes to controversial topics like that, I like to point out, like, hey, if you believe this way, you have to make sense of what's going on here, because it is certainly unique that God raises up Deborah as a judge. Do you guys want to throw in on that at all, or?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard kind of the argument that God used Deborah because there was no man that was good enough to be found, which I think that argument falls short, because if God had to use a woman in chapter 4, it gets way worse in later chapters. Why doesn't he continue to use women throughout the book? Like, I just don't think that holds water, and it certainly doesn't line up with the rest of Scripture. But it's kind of an easy answer to a complex question.
Also, if you're trying to make a case from the book of Judges,
that's not the best place.
You're
to start.
not in a great spot. Honestly, because kind of the MO for the book of Judges is that it's a very dark period in Israel's history.
Very dark for women.
It's just not great.
Yeah.
And so if you are trying to make like an overarching large picture case, there are some issues with that.
Like maybe having Samson as the picture of biblical masculinity.
Dude, not good. Not good. I've also heard that it is at least interesting to point out that Deborah does lead together with Barak. And it is Barak that are giving the commands and the I don't know, what would you say, like the military leadership, I guess. But again, that's not super clean because Deborah is still a huge part of this story.
Well, Barak says, if you don't go with me, Deborah, I'm not going.
There you go. So I just like to point out, you got to make sense of it. And it's an important story, and it is one of the better places in a dark book.
And then Jael.
The tent peg. Oh, man.
It's like, so 2 women in this story are actually the actual heroes.
What's your take on Deborah?
I mean, I don't know. I haven't studied much about it, but it is interesting to me that from what I can read here, that the Lord's asking Deborah to go to Barak and say, hey, lead the Israelites. And Barak's like, no, thank you, unless I'm doing it with you. So it seems to me that the Lord already chose a man to do it, and he decided not to. And because of that lack of faith in God, these 2 women actually get the bragging rights in this story. They led the people. They had rest in the land for 40 years afterwards. And because of these 2 women and their obedience to the Lord and their faith and their bravery.
If my bragging rights were smashing tent pegs through people's heads, I don't know that I would use them very often. You know?
Maybe don't brag about it.
There was memes floating around like that. We need some jail in this situation. I'm like,
goodness sakes.
If we're using, I think like you said it well. If we're using judges as justification for a lot of these things,
probably
not a good
should
place.
never be a character study of what you should and shouldn't do. This is purely narrative, not inspirational.
Okay, so I am gonna set you up a little bit, Chris. You are the person that I learned from that Gideon is actually not a fantastic person. I am putting you on the spot. We didn't necessarily talk about this issue, but you're the first person that I heard explain this story that basically was like, hold on a second. He might not be the shining glimmer of leadership that you think he is, because Gideon is a lot of times one of the go-to people for leadership discussions. And there are some significant problems with who he is and what he does.
Yeah, I mean, the 2 things that kind of jump out to me, I mean, one, I remember hearing many messages when I was younger about this idea of putting a fleece before the Lord. And it's kind of like we believe that God can speak and we want God to kind of confirm what he's saying to us. So you kind of like give a scenario that you know that it's God speaking. Well, the interesting thing here is like that's Gideon's idea. That's not necessarily God's idea. God has been speaking to his people all this time. But Gideon is so unsure and so insecure, I think, about hearing the God's voice that he keeps setting up these scenarios. And then even when God does it, he says, wait, can you just prove it one more time? Can you just prove it one more time? And it's actually not a trust in the Lord. It's basically treating God like a magician, that if you do X, Y, and Z, then I'll know it's you. And it's just, I think too many times we put these conditions upon God that we basically we're treating ourselves as superior. Like, God, if you jump through these hoops, then I know that it's you. So Gideon's obedience, it's not really great, and he needs to prove it multiple times. Yeah. And then the other big issue, like Gideon really wove in a lot of like Baal worship with his faith, that he's constantly, like, even his other name is Jerubbaal or something like that.
Jerubbaal.
Yeah,
Jerubbaal.
Has Baal in his name. And so he's not a purely devoted person to the Lord. He's dabbling in Canaanite worship. He's dabbling in Baal worship. And so, like, this idea of, like, Gideon led this army and all these things, like, Gideon actually was very reluctant, very fearful, very insecure. He's not really the hero of the story. It's God's the hero because God's using him in spite of all these things. I don't know if that was as inspiring as what you heard before, Ryan, because I don't totally remember having that conversation. But
I remember it because it definitely was like, oh, I never knew that. I think I remember you saying something to the effect of, like, Gideon was essentially treating God like he was used to treating all the pagan idols. And that's not how we're supposed to treat God. I also believe that it is Gideon who at the end of his life is a terrible example to follow, because he actually ends up creating an ephod for the people to worship. So he doesn't even end his life in a faithful position. And he is somebody that I've heard a lot of leadership lessons from. And now when I hear them, I'm like, oh man, like, do you even know that guy? Like, do you even know what he did? So it's another case to read the whole Bible, I think.
Welcome to today's edition of Ruining Children's Bible Stories.
Oh, shoot. Well, on that, actually, we're going to...
On that note, part 2, right?
We were going to go to Samson, but actually we're going to go to Jephthah first. Jephthah's another interesting dude. Jephthah asks God to give him victory and promises to God under a vow. So this man is at least enough aware of the law that he knows how to use a vow. He vows to God that he will sacrifice anything that comes out of his door. I used to think, like, well, maybe they had, like, chickens and goats and cows and stuff in their house. They didn't. That was not a common practice. It's very likely that he knew there were people that would come out to meet him. And he ends up assuming that because he has made a vow to God, he cannot break it. And when his daughter comes out to see him to celebrate his victory, I think, he follows through on it, which is really crazy.
Rather than humble himself and say, I made a mistake, he actually kills his own daughter.
The text is a little bit ambiguous about if it does actually occur, but we can fairly safely assume that it does actually occur.
I think based along the theme of this book, it would be counterintuitive to assume it didn't occur, because this is what is happening and it keeps getting worse.
Him understanding his faults and turning toward God would not actually fit the narrative of the book of Judges. It's pretty wild. I think Jephthah is a really compelling case for what you believe about God. Like, your actual academic understanding of what God requires is very important, because he thought he was honoring God by refusing to break his vow. But God had already proclaimed that you could not sacrifice people to honor him.
Yeah.
So his religious fervor actually caused him to commit egregious sin. So his doctrine was screwed up, so his worship was not valid. And I think it's a really, really important point for us today, because a lot of times I know that, like, doctrine, even the word is like, I don't like that. But it is important, because if your doctrine is wrong, your worship is wrong. And Jephthah proves it.
Yeah. Any vow to God, any act of worship shouldn't end in sin.
Right. Right.
Human sacrifice, not a good part of the worship service.
Correct. And then we have dear Samson.
Samson gets a lot of chapters dedicated to him.
Yes, he does, because he did so many crazy things.
Oh, okay. You just answered
That's
my
why
question.
anyway, I don't know. I just think, like, Samson, why do we teach our little boys about Samson? I don't know. I have a problem with this. Can you fix it for me, Chris? Can you solve that, please?
I mean, other than just some warped perceptions of masculinity, because we like the fact that he's strong. We like the fact that he's brave. We like the fact that he's courageous. But he's a womanizer. Mm-hmm. He's violent. And then, of course, it even feels like we feel like it ends on a happy note that he kills hundreds of people even in his death, and it's like, yeah, what? I mean, they gouged out his eyes, so he's getting them back. It's like we are cheering revenge. Like, it actually just doesn't line up with so much of Scripture, but it lines up with a good movie. It lines up with so kind bizarre. Of the John Wayne masculinity kind of, idea that we often have more than the Jesus masculinity idea. There's a lot of things there, but yeah, do you want your sons to grow up to be like Samson?
100% no.
No.
I actually, we joked about the flannel graph. I actually remember being taught this on the flannel graph, and I do remember in Mennonite church, like, how great it was that Samson defeated his enemies. It's like, wait, we don't even believe in that.
In the pacifist church, you're hearing
we don't even support that. So I was confused even as a little kid, and Samson has a lot of problems. Again, we do see the faithfulness of God to his promises because he uses this incredibly flawed person to free his people essentially from the struggles that they were enduring. But it's just not a great story. I don't know. Do you love Samson, Chelsea?
No, I don't love anybody in this
man.
book.
Bummer.
Maybe Deborah.
Maybe
Jael a little bit.
Oh,
no,
I
I'm
don't
kidding.
know. I don't know about that either.
So that brings us to chapter 19, where we are introduced to a Levite and his concubine.
It's like the true crime portion of the podcast.
It's so funny. I mean, just the heading, a Levite and his concubine.
It doesn't really flow with what a Levite should be doing.
The religious leader.
Oh, it actually sounds very 2024, though.
And his lady on the side. Yeah.
Tell us more, Chelsea.
Sounds like a headline in 2024.
It literally is like it would be the equivalent of the pastor and his mistress, the pastor and his prostitute, the alarm bells are ringing everywhere by the time we get to this story. He's essentially a Levite for hire, right? Like he's
which the priests were never supposed to make money off the priesthood. Like they were
at all, period.
Like to charge, so to speak. They were to be taken care of, yes, but not to profit.
And certainly they were not to profit worshiping idols in somebody else's house. And that's what this story is. It's very messed up. What ends up occurring, correct me if I'm wrong, there's some kind of conflict, right? And he cuts her up and sends her all over the place. Right?
Yes.
He does.
Something like that. That's the very short version.
To show how bad things have got in Israel. So it's like, okay, well, we have the fact that you're doing what you're doing is pretty bad, but it was a sign to people just how bad things had gotten.
Mm-hmm. Which incites a civil war to some degree. Because apparently the people are so offended by the fact that this has occurred. I don't know why they're offended. They seem like they've been pretty cool with everything else. They attack the tribe of Benjamin, and they almost utterly destroy the tribe of Benjamin, which leaves us on a pretty dark note because one of the cool things we've been tracking is how faithful God is to his promises and how much he cares and provides for his people. So now we're introduced to a story where his people are destroying each other almost to the point of utter destruction. The very thing that God had commanded for the enemies of himself, they are now bringing on themselves.
And we've seen a little bit of this a couple times before where it seems like evil is getting so bad that God's plans are going to be thwarted. God does actually step in and do some things, that there are these stories or glimmers of hope. We saw that with the flood, that things were getting so bad. I think we saw that with the Tower of Babel. And we're kind of seeing it in the book of Judges. But Judges doesn't really show us the good that God is doing in this time. Mm-hmm. We're going to get to see that in just a little bit.
That's why I love Ruth, because Ruth occurs in the book of Judges. I'm excited to talk about Ruth.
So what evil seems like it's going to triumph, basically. We're left
Right.
hanging on that note in Judges. But the answer, like how is God still moving his plan forward, that's in a completely separate book.
Fun fact, the very last verse says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Curtain close. The end. So
hope you're encouraged.
Yeah,
See you next week.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a dark book. Again, I already made this case. I think you should read it. I think you should read every chapter in it, and I think you should strive to understand it, because I do think it will. You probably won't love it. If you've never read it before, it'll probably frustrate you a little bit. But it is good to know that these things are in there. It's good to try to understand why they're in there. And one of the reasons that this particular book is in there is it actually shows how evil and wicked people are as they step further and further away from God. We will link in the show notes all of our old episodes that we did on this in our first season, so that you can easily just go in there and click on them. You can track them. We'll do a deeper dive in chapter by chapter. We'll give you more details about each one of these stories. I do encourage you, before next week, dig into these stories. I really do. I would love it if you would do that. So go in there, click those links, listen to them at some point, wrestle with them yourself. I think actually wrestling with these difficult stories will draw you closer to God. So I think it'd be great for you.
And wrestling with these stories also just gives you more context for the book we're about to explore next week.
The Book of Ruth. How exciting. So we'll be back again next week. We'll see you then.
See ya.